When you first spoke to me about doing this interview, I did a fair amount of thinking about it. And to kick things off, I prepared a little written introduction to sort of key you in on how I'm approaching it. And we can go on from there. In my earliest years, as far back as I can remember, and until my mid-30s, I considered myself a communist. What do I think now, at 95, about being an American communist from the 1930s into the mid-1950s? How it began for me is simple. My parents were communists, and I admired and loved them dearly. I still do, 52 years after they're gone. They were devoted to values of human decency, justice, and equality, predictably on the side of the underdog, with the courage to live and sacrifice unselfishly for the common good. How I look back upon the Communist Party now is not simple, even though most current references to 20th century communist history assume a consensus devoid of complications and contradictions. Communists were bad news. They were the un-American enemy. The facts about American socialists, including communist history, belie the simple verdict that McCarthy and his kind thrive on. Paradoxically, anti-communist hysteria did severe damage to civil liberties, while socialists fought for the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights as a cornerstone of democracy. That history is echoed today in the inspiring Sanders movement of largely young people and the widespread resistance to Trump's assault on democracy, which is probably the biggest crisis in American democracy since the Civil War. So anyway, to evaluate my time as a communist and how my thinking continues to evolve over a long lifetime, I need to think a lot about history. What incredible times we live through, how much change shapes our world and each of us. Now I'm ready to go.
So what I wanted to ask you is to unpack a little bit for contemporaries that are living now the meaning, the time-sensitive meaning of being a communist in this country.
Yeah.
That what it was to be in the 30s or 40s maybe was different than being in the 50s or 60s. Like a famous historian, Ellen Schrecker, said that after analyzing a lot of research, that the Communist Party was the most dynamic organization from the left movement during the 30s and 40s. And can you talk a little bit about the main fights of the 30s and the main achievements of?
Well, your point is well taken. There's a big difference in what period one is talking about. I was born and, grew up in the essentially first phase of what was the communist movement. The communist movement developed out of the end of World War I, and the main feature of it was the Russian Revolution and the spread of the influence of the Russian Revolution all over the world. And so, of course, I wasn't born till 1921, but I sort of became part of the world or part of history in the 20s and 30s, growing up in the Depression in the United States. My father was, as you say, a founder of the Communist Party, He joined the Communist Party actually during World War I. He was an immigrant, came over at the age of 16 before World War I, and he became a socialist in this country. Actually, a barber converted him to socialism. He always laughed about that. What really moved him more than anything was Eugene V. Debs, and the fact that Eugene V. Debs opposed the First World War as an imperialist war, and actually went to jail because of it, and in jail got millions of votes for president. My formative years were after the First World War, particularly the Depression in the United States, which started in 1929 when I was about 8 years old. And my view of things was very much influenced by two things. One, that my family at that point was already socialist and in fact communist. The other thing that was formative is in addition to being very proud of my family and their activities, which I'll describe to you, I also remember what it was to grow up in the Depression. We were very poor. We had a real sense of community that I imbibed as a child. People come to the door and you shared whatever you had. I remember our diet was not a diet that would be recommended today. My mother used to make a concoction from something called organ meat, which was 2 cents a pound. And there wasn't much milk, there wasn't much orange juice. And I remember as a child, I was skinny, I had asthma, and I remember being very cold. My brother and I used to fight over who would get into bed first, and since he was 4 years older, I was the one that had to get in bed first to warm up the sheets. So my formative years were influenced by already a pattern that was established through my father and mother's activities, and also my own experience. And very early on, I was exposed to what it meant to try to act based on principle for justice, to try to develop an outlook that the world could be a better place. My father, as I was getting older, my early experiences, I remember things like the martyrdom of Sacco and Vanzetti. I remember young communists who went to help organize in the minefields in Canada and were shot by hired thugs.
Can you expand a little bit on Sacco and Vanzetti? You were really a child. You were
Yes.
6 years old.
I was a child, but I went with my family. We waited in the square in Stamford, Connecticut, which was my hometown, waiting for the word of the execution, a scene that was replicated many, many years later when people gathered all around the world to wait for the news of the Rosenberg execution. It was a similar scene. Sacco and Vanzetti were anarchists. They were framed up as later the state of Massachusetts acknowledged, but they were executed, and despite a worldwide movement to save their lives. And of course, those things made a big impression on me as a child. Something else that made a very big impression was the demonstrations that took place in the 30s that my father was a major organizer in Stamford, Connecticut at the time. This was a town of maybe 22,000 people, if I remember the figures accurately. I don't remember them, but I read about them. So I was very young in 1930. I guess I was not quite 9 years old on May 1st. There had been 2 successive demonstrations in Stamford that my father helped organize. They were quite remarkable if you look back at the times, because while the town was very small, the demonstrations were huge, running 7,000 to 8,000 in number. And both demonstrations were without a permit. The Hoover administration, which took a very hard line, actually brought out the police against bonus marchers and refused to give permits for peaceful demonstrations. So the demonstrations had to take place on the basis of people getting on the square and standing up at different places, waiting to be arrested serially for speaking. The first demonstration was on March 6th, 1930, and it was a demonstration for unemployment insurance, which didn't exist at that time, and obviously was enormously important to the 20-odd million unemployed in the United States at the time. The people were arrested, including my father, and my father, who had a relative in town who happened to be a judge, a cousin, they were good friends at the time, warned him that if they demonstrated again on May 1st, there would be hell to pay. It was a warning. And they did demonstrate. They went through the same procedure on May 1st. Again, it was a huge demonstration. My brother and I stayed out of school, for which we were later suspended. Anyway, this time, after the individuals were arrested, they were taken into the jail. And I guess maybe a couple of years ago you wouldn't have believed this, but in the light of today's news, it's not hard to believe. They were taken out of their cells one at a time with 4 police to a person and beaten with brass knuckles and clubs. This is a picture of them after they got out of jail. They were left bleeding in jail without any medical attention until my mother and the absent-minded doctor, who was a good friend but couldn't get her birth date straight, he and my mother went to the prison and threatened to the jail and threatened to testify against the police if they weren't allowed in. So finally they were allowed in. But the people suffered. One had a broken arm. One African-American, Morris Fitch, refused to holler, refused to cry out. So they beat him till his ankles were broken. And my father had head injuries and body injuries. He couldn't sleep in a bed for weeks afterwards. So I guess that made a much bigger impression on me than any books I could have read at the age of 8 or 9. Here's this little town of Stamford, Connecticut, and you look at the array of people. Amazing at a time when white supremacy was rampant throughout the country. It wasn't just in the South. It's one of the myths that people still carry. You couldn't go into a restaurant black and white, up through the 50s in a town like Detroit or a swimming pool in New Haven, Connecticut. So anyway, and here they were, 2 African Americans, 2 Italians, an Irishman, and the usual suspect Jews. So that tells you something about what it was to be a communist in 1930. My father, after that, became the district organizer of the Communist Party in Connecticut and Western Massachusetts, which he was actually up until during World War II. And what did he do? I used to ride around with him from time to time in a succession of little Ford old cars, used cars, one of which I remember when we were driving, the front wheel came off. But he used to go around, and I went with him on occasion, organizing, because that was a period of the breakthrough against the old craft unionism that had reigned up till then through the AFL. It was the period of the real breakout of industrial unionism and the formation eventually of the Committee of Industrial Organization. And Ellen Schrecker is absolutely right. There's just no question that during that period, if it came to labor organizing, if it came to opposing lynching, all of the things which I would say all progressive Americans consider important today, well, the communists pioneered those things, and they pioneered them with their lives in a real way. So obviously, there's a checkered history of what being a communist means, and we'll come to that. I'm sure your questions will take that up. But it's important to remember, actually, in this election with Bernie Sanders running, where people are still trying to make socialism a dirty word, the fact of the matter was there was no section of the American population that was more invested in fighting for things like unemployment insurance, opposition to lynching, organizing the unorganized, than the communists. They weren't the only ones, certainly. But they were doing it when it wasn't for it, was poverty, and sometimes outright brutality.